The grand chamber of the Elysian Accord was a place designed for spectacle. It was built into the side of a lunar cliff, with walls of silvered stone that shimmered with embedded crystals. The domed ceiling reflected the stars of the outer system, and every corner was designed to make visiting dignitaries feel both awed and humbled. But it wasn't the architecture that drew everyone's attention that day. It was the figure that entered from the northern gate. 8 feet tall, covered in segmented plates of glistening black armor, the creature known only as Kethrax of the Zoric Dominion stalked into the chamber with predatory grace. Its clawed feet echoed against the floor, and each step was punctuated by a low rumble that resonated in every observer's chest. Its head, adorned with a crown of curved horns, turned slowly as it surveyed the human delegation. The humans had sent their top diplomats dressed in sleek formal wear and draped in the colors of the United Systems. They stood tall, but even the bravest among them looked uneasy as Kethrak's massive shadow fell over the delegation table. The Zoric were not subtle. They were here to intimidate, to assert dominance without speaking a word. Kethrax was their message. This is what we bring to the table. This is what awaits if you refuse our terms. The murmurs of the other species in attendance, the feathered Telvari, the crystalline Suvorin, the multi-eyed Blenkar, filled the air like static. Everyone knew the humans were outmatched in raw physical power. That was when the chamber doors creaked open again. From the human side, the first thing that entered was a German shepherd, thick-coated, bright-omed, its tail raised high with confidence. It trotted forward, tongue lolling, ears flicking with curiosity. The sight drew puzzled glances, and more than a few startled gasps. Behind the dog came a man, not tall, not armored, not draped in diplomatic finery, just a weathered figure in a simple olive-green jacket, jeans, and scuffed boots. His face was lined with age, his hands rough and scarred. His hair was cropped short, and his eyes were steady beneath heavy brows. He walked with an easy gait, not hurried, not intimidated. This was John Mercer, retired K-9 unit handler for the United Systems Security Corps, and the dog at his side was Duke. The delegation murmured louder now. Kethrak's horned head tilted, its claws clicking against the floor as it regarded the strange human pair. John stopped in the center of the chamber, directly opposite the towering predator. He gave Duke a soft pat on the flank and looked up at Kethrax with a faint smile. "Nice dog," one of the Telvari whispered nervously. "Is this a joke?" hissed a Suvorin diplomat. But John didn't flinch. He stepped closer, Duke matching his stride. The German shepherd's ears pricked forward, his gaze locking onto Kethrax with the focus of a trained working dog. There was no fear in his posture, only readiness. Kethrax bared its fangs in what might have been a smirk. It stepped forward, towering over John and Duke, casting a long shadow that seemed to swallow them whole. It let out a low growl, deep and resonant, a sound designed to unnerve prey. John met its gaze evenly. "Duke," he said quietly. The dog's response was immediate. He sat, straight-backed, eyes locked on Kethrax, his ears flicking in anticipation. Kethrax growled louder, taking another step closer. The murmurs in the chamber turned to outright whispers and gasps. Even the human diplomats shifted uneasily. John didn't react. Instead, he pulled a small ball from his jacket pocket, a worn rubber toy, and held it up. Duke's gaze flicked to the ball, then back to Kethrax. His tail gave a single wag. Then, in a move that caught everyone off guard, John threw the ball. It arced high, bouncing once, twice, rolling directly beneath Kethrax's massive frame. Duke leapt into motion, weaving between the towering alien's legs with a blur of practiced agility. Kethrax let out a startled snarl, twisting to follow the dog's movement, but Duke was already past, seizing the ball and trotting back to John's side with his tail wagging. The chamber erupted into shocked murmurs. John gave Duke a quiet "good boy," ruffling the dog's fur. He looked up at Kethrax, who was now turning back toward him with a mixture of anger and confusion. "You brought your best predator," John said, his voice calm but carrying across the chamber. "We brought ours." The silence that followed was thick, broken only by the faint panting of Duke as he sat proudly at John's side. The Zoric delegates conferred among themselves, hissing in low tones. Kethrak's claws twitched, but it did not attack. The predator was calculating now, reassessing. John knelt, scratching Duke behind the ears. "Easy, boy, we're just getting started." The chamber settled into an uneasy quiet. The human delegation exchanged glances, their initial apprehension giving way to something else. Amusement, and perhaps a flicker of hope? Because for all the Zorok's threats and displays of dominance, it was clear they hadn't expected this. They hadn't anticipated the simple, undeniable fact that the humans weren't intimidated. And as John stood, Duke still at his side, the first cracks of respect began to show on even the most hardened alien faces. The negotiations weren't over, not by a long shot, but the humans had made their opening move. The silence in the grand chamber stretched long and thin, as though the air itself was waiting for someone to speak. Kethrax remained still, massive arms folded across its plated chest, while Duke panted quietly at John Mercer's side. Then, with a deliberate slowness, Kethrax stepped back. It turned slightly, addressing the Zoric delegation in their harsh, clicking language. Low murmurs spread among the aliens, and one of the Zoric envoys, a smaller figure, though still imposing, stepped forward to translate. "The Zoric Dominion recognizes the uniqueness of your representative," the envoy said, voice dripping with condescension. "But this is a serious negotiation. We expected a warrior of appropriate standing, not an animal trainer and his pet." John's eyes narrowed just slightly, the corners crinkling with faint humor. "Funny thing about animals," he said, voice carrying easily. "You learn more about handling predators from a dog than you ever do from a gun." He let Duke sit at his feet while he straightened his jacket and approached the table. The diplomats and observers parted, watching him with a mix of confusion and curiosity. Some of the human delegation exchanged uneasy glances, but no one interrupted. John placed both hands on the polished table and leaned in slightly. "Here's the thing, folks," he said, addressing the entire chamber. "You brought Kethrax in to intimidate us, to make us think you're the top predator in the room. But intimidation only works if you forget that humans have been dealing with predators a lot longer than this negotiation's been on the table." Kethrax's claws flexed against its armored forearms, but it said nothing. "You think size, armor, and teeth are all it takes?" John continued, voice steady. "Predators hunt because it's in their nature, but we don't just fight predators. We train them. We live with them. And when it comes down to survival, we don't back down. We adapt. We learn. We bond." He glanced down at Duke, whose ears perked at the sound of his voice. The dog was alert, ready, but calm. "This guy right here, he's not just a pet. He's a partner. We've been through storms and fire together. He's pulled me out of burning buildings, tracked missing kids through blizzards, and stared down worse monsters than any of you brought today. You think your predator intimidates us? You've got no idea what we can handle." A ripple of murmurs spread through the chamber, not just from the humans, but from the other species as well. The Telvari ruffled their feathers uneasily. The Souverain shifted their crystalline forms, exchanging quiet words in their harmonic language. John's words weren't just bravado, they were an undeniable truth. Kethrax tilted its massive head, studying John and Duke more intently now. It let out a low, rumbling growl, but it wasn't one of anger. It was the sound of a predator recognizing something familiar, a kind of respect, perhaps. John took a slow breath and turned his attention back to the human diplomat seated behind him. "We came here for peace. But if anyone thinks we're going to let ourselves be bullied into submission, you're dead wrong. We don't intimidate easy. We're not prey, and we sure as hell aren't alone." The Zurich envoy stiffened. "Are you threatening?" John raised a hand, palm outward. "No threats, just facts. You brought your best predator, we brought ours. Now let's sit down like civilized species and work this out before we both lose more than we're ready to give." For a long moment, no one moved. Then unexpectedly Kethrax let out a deep, rumbling chuckle, a sound that was half growl, half laugh. It stepped back from the table and gestured toward a seat with one clawed hand. The human diplomats, sensing the shift, hurried to fill their places. John remained standing for a moment longer, giving Kethrax a nod before settling into a chair with Duke at his feet. The negotiations resumed. It wasn't easy. The Zork delegation was as stubborn as their warrior champion, but with John's quiet confidence anchoring the human side, the atmosphere shifted from pure intimidation to something closer to grudging respect. Whenever tensions flared, John would lean back and toss Duke his battered ball. The dog would catch it, tail wagging, earning a flicker of amusement even from the most stone-faced of aliens. At one point, a Suvoran diplomat, her crystalline body glimmering under the lights, leaned toward a human counterpart and whispered, "Is this tactic common among your kind?" The human smiled faintly, only when it works. As the hours passed, it became clear that Kethrax wasn't just muscle, it was observing, watching John and Duke, noting their interactions. At one point, Kethrax leaned down and made a low, guttural sound directed at Duke. The dog's ears twitched, and he let out a soft, warning woof. The alien warrior straightened, a slow nod of acknowledgement in its posture. By the end of the first session, the hard edges of hostility had softened. The Zorik weren't ready to concede, but the bluster was gone. They'd come expecting fear and submission, but they found resilience, humor, and an unexpected ally in a retired handler and his dog. As the delegates dispersed for the recess, John stood and stretched. Duke stood as well, tail wagging, ready for whatever came next. One of the human aides approached hesitantly. "Mr. Mercer, I wasn't sure about this plan, but it's working." John gave a tired smile. "That's because you're thinking like a diplomat," he said quietly. "I'm just here to remind everyone that respect isn't about teeth and claws. It's about knowing when to stand your ground and when to throw the damn ball." And as he led Duke out of the chamber, the murmurs of respect and curiosity followed him. The next session would decide everything. The second session of negotiations resumed with an air thick with tension. The human delegation sat straighter, their confidence buoyed by John Mercer and Duke's unexpected presence. The Zorik, once assured of their dominance, now eyed the humans with a mixture of curiosity and unease. Kethrax, however, had not left. It stood once more behind the Zorik delegates, a silent sentinel whose gaze never left John. The predator's claws flexed occasionally, and the rhythmic thump of its tail against the floor echoed through the chamber. John sat calmly at the human table, his hand resting lightly on Duke's head. The dog's tongue lolled in a relaxed pant, but his eyes never stopped tracking the room's movements. They were sharp, alert, and ready for anything. The session began with the Zorik delegate rising from his seat. "We recognize the unconventional approach of your representation," he said with an edge to his voice, "but this is not a circus. We are here to determine the future of interspecies peace. Shall we proceed with matters of trade and territory?" John stood. "Of course," he said. "But let's get one thing clear first. Peace isn't built on fear. It's built on trust, understanding, and mutual respect. If we're going to have a conversation, then we all need to come to the table without trying to show whose claws are bigger." A ripple of conversation spread through the chamber. Even the other species, the Telvari and Suvoran, nodded subtly in agreement. The Zorik delegate's jaw tightened. Kethrax let out a deep growl, but it wasn't menacing. It was thoughtful, almost approving. John leaned down and whispered something to Duke. The dog gave a soft woof and stood, ears perked. John reached into his jacket and pulled out a second ball, brighter and newer than the battered toy from before. He held it up, looking directly at Kethrax. "Want to try?" The chamber went dead silent. Kethrax's head tilted, its horned crest catching the light. Slowly, deliberately, it stepped forward. Its massive hand, claws sheathed, extended. With a flick of its thick wrist, Kethrax caught the ball in midair, surprising everyone. The predator warrior regarded the ball for a long moment. Then, in a move that made the entire chamber lean forward in shock, Kethrax crouched and rolled the ball back toward Duke. The German shepherd let out an excited bark and pounced on the ball, tail wagging furiously. He trotted back to John's side, dropping the ball at his feet. A stunned silence swept the chamber, followed by a low ripple of laughter. Not mocking, but incredulous. Even the Zorik delegates exchanged glances. John grinned. "Looks like we're not so different after all." Kethrax let out a rumbling sound that might have been a laugh. It stepped back to its position, but its stance was less threatening now, more open. The negotiations resumed, and this time the conversation flowed more easily. There were disagreements, of course, trade routes, resource sharing, technological exchanges, but the undercurrent of hostility was gone. In its place was a begrudging respect, born from the unlikeliest of gestures. Hours passed, and as the human and Zorik delegations worked through the sticking points, John and Duke remained at the table. Whenever tempers flared, John would quietly toss Duke a ball or offer him a treat, grounding the tension with simple, familiar action. At one point, a Telvari diplomat approached John during a recess. The bird-like alien tilted its feathered head curiously. "Your species, you use these animals as warriors?" John shook his head. "No, as partners, as family. There's a trust between us that doesn't come from strength or fear, it comes from loyalty. That's what makes the difference." The Teleri bobbed its head thoughtfully and returned to its seat. By the end of the third day of negotiations, it was clear that the tide had shifted. The Zorik were no longer pressing their aggressive demands. The humans had proven that they were not only capable of resilience, but also of forging bonds that transcended species and strength. As the final session adjourned for the night, Kethrax approached John directly. It loomed over him, the entire chamber falling silent as the predator warrior extended a massive, clawed hand. John hesitated only a moment before grasping it. Kethrax's grip was firm but careful, its claws sheathed, its posture almost respectful. "You fight with more than strength," Kethrax rumbled, its voice low and resonant. "You fight with loyalty, with understanding. It is unusual." John smiled faintly. "You're not so bad yourself." Kethrax let out a growl that could only be described as amusement before turning back toward its delegation. As John and Duke left the chamber, the murmurs of the other species followed them, whispers of a human delegation that had come to the table not with weapons or threats, but with trust, resilience, and an unexpected lesson in how to face down even the fiercest predator. And as the sun set over the lunar horizon, it was clear that the true negotiations were just beginning. The final day of negotiations dawned with a strange sense of anticipation. Even the steely walls of the grand chamber seemed less foreboding under the pale glow of the distant sun. John Mercer stood with Duke in the corridor outside the assembly hall. The German shepherd, now something of a celebrity among the interspecies delegates, sat calmly at his side, tail tapping lightly against the floor. Inside, the human delegation reviewed the latest terms, revised trade routes, resource-sharing agreements, and cultural exchange programs. None of this had seemed possible at the beginning of the talks, but something fundamental had shifted over the last few days. The fear that the Zorik had counted on had been replaced by something stronger: mutual respect. Kethrax waited near the center of the chamber, towering and silent. Its massive form, once so menacing, now carried a different weight. The predator warrior had watched, listened, and perhaps most importantly, learned. When John and Duke entered, the room fell into a hush. John didn't bother with a formal greeting. He simply walked to the human table, Duke matching his stride, and gave a short nod to the Zorik side. The Zorik envoy rose, a shimmering figure draped in deep blue ceremonial cloth. "Before we finalize these accords," it said, "there is one final matter. Kethrax of the Zorik Dominion requests an official demonstration, a test of the human delegation's resilience." A murmur rippled through the chamber. The Telvari delegates whispered nervously. The sovereign delegates exchanged low, resonant hums. John raised an eyebrow but kept his voice level. A demonstration? Kethrak stepped forward. Not combat, it said, its voice low and steady. A demonstration of trust. The chamber's whispers faded into a tense silence. John glanced down at Duke, who was sitting calmly, as if he'd known all along that it would come to this. John's lips twitched into a faint smile. All right, let's hear it. Kethrax crouched slightly and placed one massive clawed hand on the floor. Then, to everyone's surprise, it lowered its armored head until it was level with Duke. The dog's ears twitched, but he didn't move. His tail gave a slow wag. Kethrax opened its massive jaws wide, revealing rows of serrated teeth. The Zork delegates gasped. Even the human diplomats tensed. John knelt beside Duke and gave him a quiet command. Without hesitation, the German shepherd stepped forward and placed his front paws squarely between Kethrax's jaws. The chamber erupted in shocked murmurs. Kethrax's breath gusted against Duke's fur, but the dog remained calm, his gaze locked on John. Kethrax's jaws closed. Not crushing, but just enough to encase the dog's paws. It was a display of complete trust, from predator to human companion. John's voice rang out, steady and sure. This is what you wanted to see? Trust without fear? Kethrax opened its jaws and stepped back, releasing Duke unharmed. The dog trotted back to John's side, tail wagging furiously, as though nothing extraordinary had happened. The chamber, stunned into silence, now erupted into applause, a sound not just from the human delegation, but from the Tavari, the Sovereign, and even some of the Zorik delegates. The Zorik envoy inclined its head. This demonstration is acceptable. We recognize the strength not just of your species' resilience, but of your capacity for trust. It is formidable. Kethrax straightened, folding its arms across its chest, but the gesture no longer felt threatening. Instead, it felt like the closing of a pact. John stood, brushing off his knees. Good. Then let's finish this the right way, with an agreement that benefits all of us. The final terms were laid out and ratified by both sides. Trade agreements were balanced, cultural exchanges were expanded, and most importantly, a formal non-aggression pact was signed. The Zorak would no longer use intimidation as a negotiation tool, and in return, the humans pledged transparency and fair dealings. The signing ceremony was brief but meaningful. As the documents were sealed with official insignia, Kethrax approached John and extended a massive clawed hand. John grasped it firmly, shaking it with a nod. Not bad for a dog handler, Kethrax rumbled. John grinned. Not bad for a predator. When the formalities were done, John and Duke stepped outside into the corridor, leaving the chamber behind. The corridor was lined with other delegates, many of whom nodded respectfully or offered quiet congratulations. Sarah Vance, one of the human diplomats, approached. Her formal suit rumpled from the long negotiations. John, I don't know how you did it, but you changed the entire tone of these talks. John gave her a tired smile. Sometimes you just need to remind people that strength isn't always about size or claws. It's about trust, loyalty, and knowing when to play ball. Duke barked once, as if in agreement. As the delegation prepared to depart, word spread quickly through the corridors and across communication relays. The humans had not only secured a fair treaty, but had done so by demonstrating something no one else had expected. They'd shown that respect wasn't forced through intimidation, but earned through understanding. That even the fiercest predator recognized strength when it came in the form of loyalty, courage, and an unshakable bond. And so it was that a retired canine handler and his dog left the grand chamber as quiet heroes, their story whispered in halls where once there had been only threats and posturing. In the end, the aliens had brought their best predator, and humanity had sent in a vet.